Hi, my name's Ben Marks. I'm a businessman in Camden, Tennessee, and have been active in community affairs here for about the last 30 years. My family has a long history of business in West Tennessee. My grandfather was in mercantile business back in the late 19th century in Bells, Tennessee, and then my parents owned general merchandise stores in the 20s and 30s in Camden. He went into service, closed all the stores but one. When he came out of service, moved back to Camden, left the retail business and went into construction work, and then started a concrete block plant and so on and so forth. And eventually got into the lumber business, and I picked up the reins back in the 70s after I had graduated from Antioch College in Yellow Springs, Ohio, with a degree in engineering and environmental studies. At that point, I continued my education for a Master of Manual Arts at the Benton County Vocational Center, and with on-the-job training at several points around the county and a little bit outside of Benton County. But for the most part, my entire working career has been in Benton County, Tennessee. Became, during the course of that time, a licensed contractor, had a family. My wife's been a high school teacher in Big Sandy for English, and is currently the media specialist, or librarian as we used to call them, at the high school here in Camden, Tennessee. Had a couple kids who went through the local school system, and then on to college. One through Tulane, and my daughter, who is now the Marketing Communications Director for Keller Williams Realty in their national headquarters, and my son, who went to University of Colorado, and he works for the Scholars Portal in Toronto, Canada, where he does essentially a computer library task for them. Got sucked into community activities and affairs, not entirely against my will, back in the late 70s and early 80s, and served for a long period of time as the chamber president here. During that course of time, I pretty much had the full range of chamber activities, from the Christmas parade, the dunking booth, a little bit of small business counseling, and a fair bit of counseling from the State Department of Economic and Community Development, part of which included the Weststar curriculum back in, I suppose, early 80s. So pretty much my worldview was formed by those small town development activities and the schooling that you get in terms of economic development for by the state professionals. The business, which provides my living, is just a retail lumber yard here in Camden, Tennessee. We're kind of a shirt-tail operation. I have about 6 employees, and provide everything from the masonry on up. In addition, you end up being sort of the go-to guy for free pencils, nail aprons, and the poor man's architect on a lot of projects around town. So just by the nature of what you're doing in business, you're quite involved. And that's not a bad thing. That led to a little better facility in trying to work on economic development projects. I knew a lot of people from the ground up. And I was, during the course of the years when I was most active, was involved in a few business locations in Benton County and Camden, and a few dislocations. We had a large iron casting foundry that closed back in the early 80s. We were successful in locating a new magnesium smelter into, or a new operation into that old facility. We had located a small injection molding business into our industrial park. We've continued to retain a reasonably healthy remnant of the old textile business. Carhartt is still employs somewhere between 150 and 200 textile workers here in a union plant in town. In addition to that, there have been a few small additions. We added, through some local effort, a man had I guess you would call caseworks or millwork business, building door units. That was bought out by a larger concern out of Dothan, Alabama. They've expanded it some, and of course we've tried to encourage all those efforts. In addition, we fostered a little bit more of a manufacturing community out in our industrial park by locating a vocational rehabilitation center out there where they could provide some sheltered workshop and recycling activities that would be additive to the industrial tenants that are out there. Not the easiest part of the economic development and industrial development in recent years has been the part of trying to guide the community and realign my own thinking to the fact that manufacturing is essentially a shrinking endeavor in the United States, and that service has become a good deal more predominant in terms of providing at least baseline income and economic activity. I currently serve on a Tennessee River Resort District Board here in Benton County, which receives a portion of the an additional portion of state sales tax revenue that we expend in behalf of tourism and economic development in Benton County. And we've essentially been making small grants to facilitate tourism-related activities, to encourage more commerce there, rather than funding any large commercial or capital expense developments, such as a civic center or some of the facilities that one might think of would normally be associated with that, because it's really activity we're looking for, not necessarily landmark achievements. And we've had some success there, at least during the last couple of years that have been charted. We did show through the State Department of Tourism figures some increase in tourism activity, even through the recession when other communities actually were somewhat diminished. So that was a little bit rewarding. Of course, in keeping with the tenor of the times, budgets have become more restricted now, and when the going gets tough, the knives come out. So there's been more competition for those funds. In recent times, there's been more resistance to any kind of tax-based funding, and community development's become a little more difficult in general. So a little more emphasis on maintenance of effort, I guess you could call it, in those regards, and a little bit of time spent on community relations.
Okay, changes in business.
The changes in the way business is done have been considerable during the period of time that I've been involved, and I'm including a little bit of my heritage there. When my grandfather was in business, he started out as a backpacking peddler over in West Tennessee, and his brother ran a little store in town, and he would just load up his backpack and go out to these isolated farmhouses and sell a few thimbles, some thread, and maybe the occasional cast iron skillet, limited by the ability of a small man to carry, only 2 or 3. But then in my dad's day, you know, the business was on the court square. It was all about price and service. They, you know, were open from daylight until whenever the last customer left. And during the period of time when TVA was expanding in this area and building the new Johnsonville power plant, which is adjacent to our community here, they would go get $30,000 or $40,000 in cash from the bank on Friday afternoon, cash everybody's check on Friday night, and then deposit the money in the night deposit after work. And of course, when they cashed the check, they maybe would buy a pair of socks or a new pair of overalls, or, you know, at least chat you up a little bit and say, well, you know, I'm going to get me some new clothes the next time I come here. And so there was a great deal more of a community around retail trade and business than there is now. You know, price was important. People like to feel like they were getting good value, and as is always the case, they like to be acknowledged for their commerce with you, but there was very little outside opportunity to buy the goods that you needed for day-to-day living. And that made for a much closer-knit community. It also made for a much larger business community because there were any number of merchants in town who serviced different aspects of the community. And, you know, the jeweler in town, he would do watch repair. And, of course, he did cater to some of the more wealthy people in town. But everybody would have to buy some kind of a wedding ring. And it was a special occasion when you went into C.L. Barker and Sons and you were looking at rings. And you'd probably make several visits just to be sure you were getting what you wanted. But now, you know, all of that retail activity and a great deal of the interaction has really just been concentrated into purely a financial transaction. You know, it's not completely a single source vendor with Walmart being the one opportunity, but it's certainly concentrated a great deal. And that diminished our community in terms of interaction, which I think is a negative, and also in terms of the ability of the community to support community activities, because the people who supported Little League and the Boy Scouts and the Girl Scouts and all those other activities, you know, whether it be the St. Patrick's Day pageant, have been greatly diminished in number. And likewise, in a sort of a convergent trend of economic development, the most capable members of your community, the best educated ones and perhaps the most aggressive ones, will often pursue an opportunity out of town because mobility is not really an issue even in the middle class, you know, which is really where most of us dwell in rural communities. And you have a constant drain of resource, you know, and your base is diminished. And that's not a plus for small towns. It's difficult for me to understand how the country can continue to thrive if it's sort of holed out, you know, with all the most of your personnel and capability resource and your financial resource being pulled out and either migrating to the coast or being transferred in terms of financial transfers to a corporate office, and all you're left with is just day-to-day commerce in a community. You know, it's not the strongest base for a well-rounded community, and I think that's a real issue going forward for small towns. Camden has been somewhat fortunate in Benton County because, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, we've tried to transition from manufacturing to service. Service in our case meaning sometimes tourism activity related to Kentucky Lake, and that's provided a little more economic activity and some seasonal improvement in financial condition, but it's tenuous, and those typically are lower wage positions. We're hampered in trying to engender any large capital developments. If you have a large capital development, you know, be it a marina or some kind of a resort community, those often are financed by out-of-town concerns, and that, you know, therefore means that not all the money is retained in the community. It's a difficulty. We benefited a little bit from the boom in residential construction during the time when second homes were fashionable and affordable. Now we have a little bit of constriction because when you have that kind of second home development, often those are people that are retired and they want to maintain tight control over costs, so they're not always the most amenable to tax increases because of reduced sales tax revenue. They're not always the ones who are the most interested in expansion or improvement in local school systems. There are issues there around community development where it's not 100% a shared goal anymore. And that's an issue for a small community because you only have enough resource to devote yourself to a couple of projects, and when you don't share a vision of what those projects need to be in terms of priority, that can provide for a pretty contentious decision-making process. And we're not always the best at doing that in a smooth and non-prejudicial way. Sometimes they say that, you know, politics in a small town gets real personal real quick, and that's not the best place to decide those issues sometimes. If we're going to deal with other areas besides business development, I think we might take a short look at, well, let me refer to your list. TVA came to the Tennessee Valley, which would have been early 40s and then certainly after World War II. That generated kind of a blossoming of economic development and population development. Those were not necessarily bad times for agriculture because we were an ag-based economy at that point, and it brought in new blood to our community because with the TVA power plant, industries that were large power users could suddenly relocate in the South. They could take advantage of the labor resource. That introduced new money into the business, and this area was successful in locating a couple of those, the most significant being an E.I. DuPont titanium dioxide facility, which is just adjacent to the community here. That made for a real blossoming in the 60s and 70s as that plant was successful and expanded. It changed our essentially agricultural community to more of a cash economy. It engendered improvements in education, transportation, because the state was also expending certain amounts of money, as well as at the national level. The interstate highway came through the southern part of our county, and that brought additional little infusion of commerce to the area, and it tied us in terms of manufacturing so that we had an outlet that was economically viable. Then, during the period of time when there was concentration of corporate interest into fewer and fewer vendors, as referred to like Walmart, and fewer providers, with the diminishment of all the small textile factories, the HIS factories, Salant and Salant, the people that provided formerly inexpensive clothing, a market that's now been taken over essentially by imports in the Philippines, Nicaragua, and China. There was, considerable restructuring in rural communities, and not all of it to the advantage of community cohesiveness. Competition made the availability of jobs more critical. That led to some internal rivalry. It made for less of a shared community division. There was also an increasing emphasis just on financial success as opposed to community success. The culture of sort of admiration or reverence or whatever that's built around tycoons like Bill Gates or Rupert Murdoch or some of these people that are perhaps high-tech innovators and have been quite successful wasn't so predominant in those days. It was, perfectly satisfactory to have a good, solid job in the community, a grounding in community activities, and a productive and involved family. That was pretty much as far as our aspirations went. The idea of anyone from the local area becoming a millionaire was pretty much alien to anybody, and about as far as one could aspire would actually become a local car dealer at some point and therefore have a new car every year. That certainly changed, and in that change, in that transition, we've become a little less cohesive as a community. There's a little more striving for advantage. There's an accelerated brain drain, if you want to call it that, of your most capable graduate students and some of the most capable technical people following bigger money because opportunities are always better compensated in larger metro areas. And that's led to a situation where we don't really compete evenly. You sometimes have to, you always try and market what your strengths are, which is, a wonderful community, great quality of life, some opportunities for leadership that might not exist in a bigger market. But, it's often hard to quantify those in dollar terms, and that provides a difficulty in terms of trying to retain your best, brightest, and most capable. It also sometimes provides an advantage in attracting people in as they're in a less ambitious phase of their career, but that's a very slow game, and it's one that we have not been completely successful in pursuing, because the glamour has always been in locating a big factory in a community, and although we've had some success there, you're not going to hit a home run every time you swing the bat, and you pay every time you swing. So it provides a difficulty. Okay, I've been challenged here by your questions, one of which is, if you could leave one message to the future generations, what would it be? Or describe your philosophy on life. So, faced with that not small task, I think if I had a message, it would be that when you're in a small community, if you will forgive me this analogy, it's not so much, you can imagine yourself as being a tree in the forest. It's not so much the size of the trunk or how tall the tree grows, but just as important is the roots that you put down, and the effect that those have in preserving the ground, or in stabilizing the whole organism, if you want to think of it in that kind of a way. And it's a mistake to think of living in a small community as you're there to take in what you can and make the most of it for your own benefit. You also have to think about fitting in to your small community and spreading the benefit around, because in my business, which is absolutely a relationship business, building is all about a partnership to get your project done. It's got to be, the trade has to be good for both sides, or it's not a fair trade. And it's not a good trade, or it's not a trade that'll ever be repeated. And in a small town, repeat business is all there is. If you don't develop a relationship, and if you don't have an ongoing part in the community, then you're just gonna be cast out. Or you're not gonna be a productive part of the community, might be a better way to put it. And so involvement is critical, and I think that would be the message that I would try and convey to anyone who moves into a small community. If they haven't grown up in that community, it's important to send out some feelers and put down some roots, because that's what makes the community work, and without that, you just don't have a community. Likewise, you wouldn't have a business.